back to the question I want to ask, why did this happen? I've focused in talking about this on the proximate causes, that is, the kinds of policies undertaken after 2001 that led to the crisis. But yet, you don't have to wonder why so many countries went down this path, why so many countries undertook such a similar series of policies that most people looked at and said, this is not a good idea. This is not going to end well. And I'm going to suggest three factors. The first is the extraordinary level of international financial integration. We have today, more than really any time in the past, and back in the gold standard era in the 19th century, we had pretty integrated financial markets, but nothing like the speed and size of today's global financial markets. For all intents and purposes, there is an enormous pool of capital available to be lent or invested, tens of trillions of dollars. It can be done very rapidly, very efficiently, right? And it can be withdrawn very rapidly and very efficiently. So for all intents and purposes, we have one global financial market, and it is huge. That is, in many ways, in most ways, I would say, a good thing, because it means that countries that need to or have economic needs to undertake substantial investment projects can borrow to do so. Countries that need to develop their infrastructure or their educational system or their manufacturing industries have access to this capital if they can borrow it and use it for productive purposes. And a lot of countries have done amazing things with this enormous pool of capital. I just got back 2 days ago from Sao Paulo in Brazil. I hadn't been in Sao Paulo in about 10 years. And Brazil is booming. And it's largely booming because it has had access to this enormous pool of capital over the last 25 or so years. And other countries have done extraordinarily well as well. They've also done extraordinarily well. But this financial integration it makes great opportunities available to countries, but it also imposes tight constraints. And it means that things can turn around in a matter of hours if market sentiment turns against you, as we found in the US and as the Europeans found as well. So that's the first factor that I would point to, the extraordinary integration of international financial markets. But then there are two other realities that I think are important to focus on. The first is that starting in the early 90s or so, most governments, in one way or another, for one reason or another, gave up monetary policy as a main tool of economic policy making. It's come back, of course, in the crisis, but that's the crisis. I'm talking about in normal times. And they did it in a variety of ways. In some cases, like in Europe, they gave up monetary policy by giving up their own currency. So 17 European countries gave up their monetary policy and delegated it to the European Central Bank. In many developing countries, monetary policy as a tool, an active tool of macroeconomic policy was given up by pegging the currency to the US dollar or to the yen or to the euro. Many dozens of developing countries have done that. In the US and the UK, monetary policy was effectively given up by saying we're going to have a very strict target. We're going to keep inflation down to 2%. And we're not going to allow any deviations from that. There were reasons for this. The principal reason is that we had some very bad experiences in the US and elsewhere in the 70s and 80s with extremely high levels of inflation, high for American standards, astronomical in some countries, 5,000% in Brazil, things like that. And I think people had come around, both policymakers and the public had come around to the notion that inflation was extremely costly and that we wanted to avoid going back to those inflationary times. So for all intents and purposes, most governments, most of the time, gave up monetary policy as an active tool of economic management. Well, governments give up monetary policy doesn't mean that they're not under pressure to do something about the macroeconomy. And so as monetary policy is given up as a tool, governments find themselves still under pressure to do something, and they have more and more recourse to fiscal policy. And you can see this in individual cases. As you see in the European cases, as country after country fixes its currency to the Deutschmark, which is how they first got towards monetary integration, they fix their monetary policy, that is, they give up their independent monetary policy, and they start running big fiscal deficits. Because the Italians, or the Spaniards, or the Portuguese are still under pressure to do something about unemployment. They can't, as they had in the past, deal with unemployment by devaluing the currency and lowering interest rates, because they don't run their own monetary policy. So they do it by running expansionary fiscal policy. Right? So this reminds me of what an Italian head of the Italian Business Association told me in the late 80s when we were talking about the effects of Italy having given up its monetary policy and pegging the lira to the Deutschmark. He said, well, it's true. That process meant that we lost 1.5 million manufacturing jobs. But it's all right, we made them up in the public sector. Right? So the Italian government borrowed 3, 4, 5% more of GDP every year after it gave up the independence of the lira to run big deficits and to hire people in the private sector, in the public sector, to deal with the economic and the political effects of having given up its monetary policy. Right? So that's the first, this is the policy factor. The surrender of monetary policy makes it much more attractive for governments to use active fiscal policy and to run big deficits. Now, if you interact that, or you think about that in the context of a global financial market that has trillions of dollars available to lend, it means that governments that do want to run deficit spending can finance it relatively easily. Right? The US government, if it wants to run deficits, it's no problem. Anyone will lend to the US government. And before the crisis hit, anyone would lend to the Italian or Spanish or Portuguese or British governments. So tremendous incentives for national governments to run big deficits and finance them from abroad. So that's the first policy factor. The second one is the one that I talked about before, which is not just in the US, but almost everywhere, a couple of decades of stagnation of middle-class consumption, middle-class incomes. Right? So not only are governments under pressure to do something about unemployment, they're under pressure to do something about the fact that the middle classes, and in some cases the working classes, or, I don't know how you want to divide these segments of the population, but substantial portions of the middle and working classes in pretty much all developed countries have seen their consumption possibilities stagnate or decline, which, as in the American story, gives governments an incentive to overcome this or try to address this by encouraging households to take advantage of their access to international financial markets to borrow. That was the story in Spain. That was the story in the US. That was the story in the UK. In all these borrowing countries, in almost all these borrowing countries, a very important backstory is not just that the government could borrow easily, but that the government could encourage households to borrow easily, which they did. Okay? So if you put all this together, you get a picture in which governments find that they are under political pressure to increase their activism in the economy, the macroeconomy, and under pressure to allow or encourage middle and working class consumption to increase in the context of $30 trillion on world financial markets sitting there waiting to be lent out, which means that there are great incentives for both governments and households to borrow heavily, great incentives for governments to encourage households to borrow heavily, and therefore great possibilities for excessive borrowing going to purposes which are not really productive. It's a point that the Latin Americans, which is where I did a lot of my early research, that the Latin Americans learned in the 1970s and 1980s, and the countries have learned before that. Ragnar Nertzi, who was an economist at the League of Nations, wrote a very famous book in the late 1940s, looking back on the interwar period, on the 20s and then the period before then. And he concluded, he said, one of the most important lessons that poor countries, they call them developing countries, and poor countries learned, or maybe countries in general learned in the 1920s and 30s was that international finance was a little bit like an umbrella that they would give you when the weather was good and then take away as soon as it started raining. That, in other words, international finance can make the good times a lot better and the bad times a lot worse. And that's what Latin Americans found in the 70s and the 80s, that access to more or less unlimited finance, which was the case in much of Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, other Latin American countries essentially could borrow whatever they wanted by the late 1970s. Access to more or less unlimited finance can have a lot of benefits, but it can also relax constraints on policymakers, on the private sector, and on consumers in ways that can lead them to borrow way more than is healthy for a national economy. Encourage people to take on debts that are not going to productive purposes, that are riskier than prudent, can encourage financial institutions to make loans that are not really going to productive purposes and that are riskier than is prudent, and that eventually can lead to a crisis such as the one that we're living through. So that's just some thoughts about the deeper causes of the crisis as opposed to the more proximate causes, and I think it has important implications, but I'll leave them.